effects of behavior charts as an intervention for level 2 behaviors, specifically for 5th grade students. So kind of as an introduction on why we chose this, our school's currently in the year 1, or just completed year 1 of PBIS, so we're still looking at systematic and individual interventions for behavior modification. We did start a new MTSS system this year, which seemed to be a little difficult for teachers, so we want to try to find a streamlined approach to be able to get everyone at least one intervention that they know they can turn to when these problems arise in their classroom. Our school also has a very large percentage of level 2 behaviors. The majority of our behaviors are level 2. And we want to make sure we're searching for a tool that helps teachers in the classroom, which for this case will be the behavior charts, and we're going to look at the impact of the behavior chart on those level 2 behaviors. So in our school last year, there were 262 in-school suspensions for level 2 behaviors, which means there were 262 times that students are missing instruction throughout the school year, which is more than days we have in the school year. So we definitely need to look for an intervention for our level 2 behavior. We need to provide some kind of a research-based method for teachers. Our goal has got to be to decrease these level 2 behaviors. And of course, we need to determine if these charts could be successful in being used in the classroom. So the research that went with this started with McCurdy, Kurdish, and Reinstein. They said that 10 to 15% of all students in our country are at risk for having these level 2 problem behaviors, and that these behaviors, as they go through their school career, will lead to failure at school, will lead to delinquency, substance abuse, and in another article said that it will lead to risky sexual behavior. So it is important that we find a way to decrease these. The research shows that if we start earlier, the results are better later on. So it is important that we find a way to decrease these problematic behaviors in elementary school, to increase their higher academic achievement as they move on, and to increase their quality of life beyond school, because our goal is to make sure that they are ready when they leave school. Scott and Karen told us that the interventions must begin early. Most of the research has interventions starting in middle school, so this study will bring it down to elementary school to see the results with that. It does need to be proactive rather than reactive, which is good because that's part of our PBIS approach. We want to make sure it's positive and we start it and we fix it before those things can ever happen. There also is a variety of approaches for these interventions. They're systematic and individualized. So our systematic would be like our PBIS, it's school-wide. And then individualized would be the interventions we pick for specific students. And again, we want to reduce these disruptive behaviors using these systematic and individualized methods. Our intervention needs to be proactive, starting from day 1 before we realize that these things are going to get worse. The very first thing is obviously that systematic with the PBIS, and then as we notice things that are occurring, we want to immediately step in and start a level 2 intervention, which for this case study will be the behavior charts. Scott and Karen also wrote an article talking about consistency, that behavior intervention will not work if it is not done consistently. It also needs to be extremely simple to make effective use of time and resources in the classroom. You need to be able to have something so simple that teachers could work with multiple students with this intervention, but it's still individualized to them. So the behavior chart will work well for that because you could have multiple different charts going on in the classroom at the same time, and it's a very quick way of checking on expectations. And we need to remember that with our behavior interventions, it's not just an issue of safety, it's also an issue of academic achievement. The modified check-in, check-out plan is what they use in middle school and high school. It's like a behavior chart in the fact that they'll check in the morning, they get feedback regarding their behavior throughout the day. It's almost like a report card that's given on how they meet expectations, where they met all of them, some of them, or none of them. We're going to try to change this a little bit for elementary school. Still let them pick their goals. It's going to be designed on a percentage that they need to meet the expectation. So in elementary school, we pick 80% as proficiency, so we'll go with 80% as proficiency with their behavior as well. And we need to make sure we start with a behavior management team which for us is like our SPS team will review the data periodically and adjust the plan based on progress as needed. This check-in, check-out system is an ideal plan for level 2 behavior problems because it's very it's less time consuming than a full FBA. It can be done with multiple students at the same time in the classroom, like we said before, but it's still customizable for each student and it's very quick. The goal, of course, of all interventions is to eventually wean the student off of the intervention. This has proven effective at the middle school, but does need adaptation for the elementary school level. So my research question was, what is the effect of a behavior chart on the instances of level 2 behaviors in our 5th grade students? I chose to use action research for this because I wanted to make sure that we could change, modify, and continue through cycles as needed with our SPS team. We chose the level 2 behaviors because almost 58 out of every 100 students are having office referrals for level 2 behaviors. And our top 5 behaviors that they're getting referrals for are disruptive behavior, physical aggression, following staff directions, and fighting, which if we kind of break those off into our definitions of level 2 behaviors, they fit mostly chronic level 1s or first offense bullying. And over 34% of these are occurring in the classroom, so that's definitely a place where we need to meet the behaviors head on. So our behavior chart is going to be suggested as intervention to look at the effect that it will have on these level 2 behaviors. The sampling of students we used for this survey or this study is 3 students from my homeroom. They are ages 10 and 11, all 5th grade students, 2 boys and 1 girl. There is 1 IEP with reading, math, and speech. All 3 of these students have been identified by our SPS team as having repeated level 1 and 2 infractions. So the students you're going to see in this study are student A, X, and J. Student A is a boy, he's 10 years old. X is also a boy who's 10 years old, and J is a girl who's 11. And we'll find out a little bit more about them later on and how that might influence their data. For this study, I needed the original SPS referral for behavior intervention. We need the level 2 definition of behaviors. We need the SPS meeting minutes so that we can make sure we are recording what modifications or interventions we decide to use. We need the actual behavior charts where goals and rewards have been set up by student, teacher, and the team. And of course, we'll need our raw data. We'll need to be bringing those to meetings and looking at the percentage of time they're meeting their expectations and goals. So this is a copy of the original SPS intervention referral form. So anytime we have a student who we think is going to need these interventions, we have to fill this out and turn this in. So all 3 of these students have had this filled out, turned in. We met with the SPS team and discussed possible interventions, and in this case, we decided to try this behavior chart. So these are our definitions for level 2 behaviors here at school. The 2 we're going to mostly look at would be like our chronic level 1s, the profanity, because that has a lot to do with the respect issue that we're seeing in classrooms. Those are the 2 issues that our students that we're looking at for this study are going to mainly have. SPS meetings take place every 4 to 6 weeks, and every time we have one, minutes are taken. We want to make sure we discuss the interventions, we discuss modifications, and we also would have a discussion of, or a summary of the discussion that was made so that we can record everything that we've decided to do. And of course, this is the point where you want to make sure that parents are aware that this intervention is going to take place. The behavior charts for each student were completely individualized. We never wanted to include more than 2 to 3 goals for each of our students since they are elementary school. We chose 2 goals. Student A's goals were stay on task and stay in his area. Student X was to stay on task and be respectful. And student J's goals were to be respectful and stay in their area. And they would receive their rewards at 80% of meeting the expectation throughout their check-in times. For these students, there is 2 check-in times that we'll look at later. We'll need the data that must be kept by the homeroom teacher. It needs to be kept by goal and then turned into the case manager. Monthly would be best and brought to all SPS meetings so that we can actually look at the data and use that to decide what modifications would need to be made. So before I chose these students, I looked at my homeroom reteach log, which is like my tier 1 reteaches, looked for some patterns, came up with these 3 students that were really having some issues, and we just put them on the SPS team. Referral came back, this is the intervention. Their first check-in then is early in the morning, about 8:30 in the morning. And then as the day goes on, they have 2 other check-in times, one in the middle of the day and one at the end of the day. And this was kind of spread out for them, but if needed, the SPS team could have come back and said it needed to be closer together. They also chose their own rewards for meeting their goals. So some of the options that they included were iPad time, computer time, sitting with a friend at lunch, homework passes, things like that. To keep the data for the study, we reviewed the data at every check-in. So every time a student would bring me their chart for a check-in time, we'd look at, are they meeting the goal? How often are they meeting the goal? Which goals are they meeting, or which ones are challenging? And any comments that are from the staff. And if you looked at the previous example of the chart, you'll notice there are comments from the staff on the chart, which is good to look at because the bottom of this one talks about how this student might need an additional goal. So we could write that in our SPS minutes for the next time to possibly add that goal later on. At the end of the day, all charts were kept by me, and I would input that data weekly into a chart that then popped out a graph, and then met with our SPS team every 4 to 6 weeks to look for anything that needed to be modified or changed. So this is an example of how I kind of picked these students. So looking at their tier 1 data. So this is, you'll see on one side, the real small bars, that's the average incidences of these behaviors out of the entire class outside of these 3 students. So like off task in any given week in November, there was like 0.25 instances of students being off task. If you look at student A though, he had 3 just for that week, where the average is much lower. So we kind of use this to pick the goals for those students. So student A, obviously his goal was going to be off task and out of area because those were his major issues. Student X had larger amount of issues, but we really wanted to focus on just 2 at a time. So we chose to work on off task and being respectful. And then for student J, again, we chose the respect and out of area. So here you'll see the student A, again, he is a boy. He has had these behaviors consistently throughout his elementary school career. Since 2nd grade, mom has been made aware of these issues. Doctor visits have been recommended multiple times, however, she has declined to do that. Student X is also a boy. He's 10 years old. He started mid-year 4th grade, so a year prior to this. He lives with dad and stepmom. He has been taken away from mom in the past and has a very traumatic life at home. Student J is a girl. She's new to the school. She does have IEP for reading, math, and speech. She's a little too mature for her age, and she strongly worries about what other people think of her. So looking at this data is where I made the SPS referral. We picked the interventions, we picked the goals for that intervention, and then they went on that behavior chart. So student A's goal, one of his goals was to stay on task. The chart started November 11th. You'll see the droops here before the star. That was prior to the behavior chart being put in place. The star is implementation. So you'll see that there's a very large jump as soon as the chart is implemented. Call it like the honeymoon period. His mornings were better, and then towards the end, the afternoons kind of leveled out with the mornings with that intervention of the chart that was going on. You'll also notice a huge dip around November 30th, which is right after Thanksgiving break. So when he's out of school for a period of time, he comes back and those behaviors, meeting the expectation, drops significantly. Looking at his average time meeting the expectations prior to intervention, about 32% of his morning was spent on task, and then after the intervention, there's an average of over 88 to almost 89% of his day on task. So there is a large difference there. 25% of his afternoon up to 78% of his afternoon. His other goal was to stay in his area. We still targeted on November 11th. The afternoon was better before the intervention, and then afterwards the morning became better. Again, there's a large dip after Thanksgiving, a large jump with implementation. His percentages again have gone from 20s, 30s, 40s up to high 80% of being on or in his area in the morning and afternoon. So here's a summary for student A. Before the intervention, he spent about 29% of his day on task. With the intervention, he got up to 83.25% of his day on task. He went from 35.5% of the day in his area up to almost 87% of his day in his area. Before and after interventions, Tuesdays and Thursdays remained the best for him. Mornings were probably better for him being on task because he is more awake in the morning. He comes in very bouncy and ready to go in the mornings. The afternoons were probably better for being in his area without the intervention because math is in the morning. He is in a low math class, so he could be getting up constantly to asking for help in that math class. Mondays were hard for him specifically, but they seem to be hard for most people on average. And Fridays were hard for him as well, possibly due to the excitement for his weekend. He does love to be home, very strong relationship with his siblings and his mom. Student X goal of being on task, we still started the chart November 11th. All of them started on the same day. Mornings were better before. Mornings are still slightly better after the intervention. However, you'll notice his are very up and down. There isn't much of a pattern to his, but remember that he's had a very traumatic life, so this is how he is on a daily basis, very up and down. Tuesdays and Wednesdays seem to be the worst for him. He again has a dip after Thanksgiving break, but you'll notice he also has a dip leading up to Thanksgiving break, so it could be some anticipation with that break, having to be home for so much time. So before the intervention, he spent about 27% of his morning on task. Afterwards, we got up to 84% of his morning on task. 17% of his afternoon, up to almost 74% of his afternoon. Still not at proficiency, but definitely a lot more time. He also had a goal of respect. Again, Tuesdays and Wednesdays were the worst for him. It's still very up and down. Mornings seem to get a lot better after the intervention. We still had a large jump with implementation. However, he did get to proficiency with meeting his time or meeting his goal of respect for both morning and afternoon. Some of the things with him on why this data probably looks the way it is. Respect is probably worse in the mornings prior to the intervention because math is in the morning. He was in the low math class before the intervention started. With the start of the intervention, he was spending more time on task, which then led for his grades to improve and allowed him to move out of that low math class and into the other math class where there's only one staff member, where compared to the lower math class, there were 6 adults in that room at any given time who he had an issue working with because he did not have strong relationships with those adults. And so that's probably increase in his respect, which is because he had an increase in on task, which improved his academic achievement, which is what we said this is also important for. Fridays are possibly good due to excitement for the weekend. The start and the end of his week tended to be the best, which I thought was a little different, but maybe he was ready to get back at it and then ready to get home. He also began family therapy during this intervention time in November, so that would also have an impact, especially on the respect goals that he had. Student J's goal was to stay in her area. Again, the chart started on November 11th. You'll see a jump with implementation, not as large as with the boys, but there still was a jump. She was still very up and down with being in her area. Mornings did seem to be better. Tuesdays and Wednesdays were again the worst, so she started the week out well, ended the week well, but the middle got a little iffy. She still had very large dips after school breaks. She did not reach proficiency with either her morning or her afternoon with being in her area. However, there's still a very large increase from our 20s and 30s up to high 70s. For respect, her afternoons became better after the intervention. However, it's still very up and down. Tuesdays and Wednesdays were still her worst. She does well at the beginning and the end of the weeks. Here she had minimal dip with breaks, which was interesting, especially for respect. If she stayed home, you'll notice that it's just a very small dip on November 30th after Thanksgiving break. She did meet proficiency with her afternoon respect goal. She's very close with that morning goal. So before her intervention, she was spending about 33% of the day in her area where she belonged, and she got to about 77% of the day in her area. 37% of her day being respectful, up to 82% of her day being respectful, which did meet proficiency looking at the average of the whole day. Middle of the week seemed to be the best before intervention. Then with intervention, the start and end of the week became the better. So respect might have become better in the afternoons after the intervention because she also changed reading teachers. So she was in one class for reading before the intervention. With the intervention, she moved to another class which had a different teacher. There was also a good increase in respect, possibly due to the year going on and building relationships with those staff members as the year goes on. One really important thing to note, though, is as the student does better in the classroom, the bus referrals started to increase, possibly a new outlet for her behavior. So this is a summary of the data based on goal. So looking at the first one, increase on time on task, would be for student A and student X. So the blue is on task before the intervention and the orange is after the intervention. So if we're staying in their area, it's going to be student A and student J. Blue is before and orange is after. And for respect is student X and student J. Blue is before the intervention and orange is after. So there's definitely an increase in time meeting the expectations, which in turn means that there was a decrease in the level 2 behaviors with this behavior chart using the positive reinforcement of the goals. However, we also had family and personal therapy that began for these students that would affect their behaviors as well. There was many changes of environments and staff during this time, and as the school year goes on, we know that relationships get built and they are stronger with some staff members over others. So all of that's going to influence this as well. This is how long it really took to get to consistency. So for the goal of staying on task with the behavior chart, it took on average these students 11 days to get to where they were consistently meeting their 80% proficiency goal. And then after a school break, like Thanksgiving, it took an average of 2.5 days to get that back to consistency. With staying in the area, it was about 10.5 days to get to the consistency, and only 2 days after breaks to get back to where it was supposed to be. The interesting thing is that being respectful took the longest to get there, but once you got there, it was only 1 day after break before they remembered or got back on track of being where they needed to be. And this could be very beneficial when presenting this as an intervention to teachers. They kind of know what to expect when they do have breaks or how long it might take to see results. So this data is just going to kind of show a rate of change. Of course, as the school year goes on, everyone starts to do better with expectations, especially since this data comes from earlier in the school year. The green bars show November, the orange bars show December, and this is the expectation of staying in our area. So for the average student in the classroom, the other 21 students, they had a 70% decrease in those reteaches, or they were doing better 70%, whereas our intervention group was able to drop their instances by 92%. And for the expectation of being off task, there's still a 24% decrease for off-task reteaches with the other 21 students in the classroom, where there's an 89% change for our intervention students. And for respect, not a large change for the classroom, but respect is something that we expect most students to have. So I wouldn't expect a huge decrease there anyway. There was still about a 1% change. However, if you look at our intervention students, which is probably one of the most issues that teachers have with some of our students in this building, there was a 91% change from the way they were being disrespectful in November to their time being respectful in December. So this is kind of where we need to decide where the next steps for this research are going to go. So the question we had, or I had at the beginning, was what's the effect of a behavior chart on the incidence of level 2 behaviors in 5th grade students? We can see that it definitely had an effect, and hopefully it remains to be positive. However, we definitely need to continue this on. And one thing that I would recommend is that we continue this or add this, I guess, across grade levels so that we can see if this data will remain, or if this intervention would remain positive at other grade levels. So what kind of things do you guys think that we should do with this?
I think teachers are often intimidated by developing a chart, and I think you demonstrated how it can be relatively simplistic, and I think you could offer really good pointers on how to use those in practice without it detracting from your instructional time.
Right, because we definitely want to make sure it's extremely simple, because we do have 21 other students in the classroom, and they're a priority as well.
I think you'd have to understand that the behavior chart is not what's actually changing the behavior. That is the monitoring tool. So what you could really teach is what's happening during those check-in times. What is the instructional component that is teaching the children to be respectful, teaching the children to be on task? So when they're off task and you're marking it on the chart, what is the prompt that you're giving?
Right.
What are the words that are being said? Because that's the instructional component that's changing the behavior, not specifically the chart itself.
Right. So we know it's going to have some kind of an effect